We're beginning the last plenary session of this year's code. This is something that we tried starting last year, is having a practitioners panel. So first we have Katrina Benjamin, who's the Chief Product Officer at Apartment List and formerly spent a lot of time at Upwork. We have Sheridan Hitchens, who's a Product Management Director for Experimentation at Facebook. We have Yazoo, VP of engineering and data science at LinkedIn. And so I think just a great lineup of experts of really using cutting edge experimentation practices as part of the broader set of data-driven decision making, product design, product development, particularly in the tech industry. So I think there's a lot we can talk about, and I'm going to be happy to take questions from the audience. But just to kind of kick things off, I think one of the things that, especially as a company grows, you have to make a decision about is how data science is organized in the company. Is data science kind of a separate function, separate organization that product teams go to, or how deeply embedded are data scientists and experimenters in product teams? And I know one place that this can kind of come up as an issue is once you start to get really embedded in the team, the data scientists often have the same incentives as the rest of the team. So they want to find out that everything they're doing is great. Whereas maybe some people would say that a data scientist should be a skeptic. And so how do you think about the trade-offs of centralizing versus embedding data science? Which parts of data science or experimentation tooling should be in the product organization? Which parts should be in tooling? And since you were nodding and smiling a little bit, I'm going to go to you, Sheridan. What do you think?
Yeah, so at Facebook, or sorry, I keep on calling it Facebook, at Meta, we are, in general, the data science function is kind of embedded within the product organizations. And I think that's fairly typical. Once you become a large organization with lots of different product lines and lots of different complexity, it's very difficult for one individual data scientist to have the context across the organization. I think your term skeptic is an interesting one. I prefer thinking of data scientists as Switzerland, right? So not necessarily having kind of one point of view or another, but being completely neutral. I think the incentive thing is an important component as well as the type of personalities and things. And like leadership is something we look for in all of our data scientists, and part of that is the willingness to go against the grain. I think the incentive side is important, but we see data scientists having to make tough calls and disagreements when a team may want to ship something, but a data scientist sees something that's bad, and that's something that they'll get credit for, right? So we made a tough decision not to ship something, right, based on detailed analysis that I did. So I do think it comes down to a lot around the types and skill sets that you're looking for in a data ship, and the influence, as well as the right incentive structures.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify, from where you sit in the organization, you are kind of part of more of an analytics and data science organization and experimentation tooling.
Yeah, that's right. I'm in a central organization, which is a central product organization, and so our team is responsible for building the kind of the platform and infrastructure that powers the experiments right across Meta.
Cool.
I'll jump in on this one too. On my team, we have the analysts and decision scientists as well as the product managers and the designers. And I think it's less about org design, but it's more about kind of the parameters that you set up and the ownership, I would say. We have kind of as our core value for analysts is to be objective. And that is kind of one of the primary values that they try to bring to their work every day. What's really important though is to learn well. Every test is, you only fail. A test is only a failure if you don't learn from it. And I find that the closer you are to the team that is working on something, the better learnings you can extract, because you know what questions to ask, you know where to look, you know what the customers are telling us and why we wanted to launch this in the first place. And so I lean more towards it doesn't have to be kind of fully embedded, but if you think about like product ownership areas on a permit list, we have renters and we have properties that we serve. There are analysts who really think about the renter side, and there are product managers who think about the renter side, and kind of all of our teams are mapped that way, as well as properties. You know, there are people who just think about that side of the marketplace and understand those customer problems. And so what I wouldn't compromise, that closeness to the goals and that ownership, that shared ownership of the goals, but we also can't get to the point where there's objectivity. And so what I really don't like is, for example, like we have data scientists, ML kind of modelers, like they could analyze their own tests. I don't think that you should launch a test and analyze your own test. I think that, you know, having that third party is useful, but I don't think you have to be so far removed to ensure objectivity. I think you can just, you know, have that as an objective and as a value, and kind of hold people accountable to that within a structure that's actually very fairly close and fairly aligned.
Mm-hmm. And so part of the answer to me sounds like the idea that if you have standardized process and tooling, right, that's going to make analyzing the experiments very standard in some ways, then that maybe makes that sort of objectivity easier to maintain, even if somebody's deeply embedded in things. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna, you know, Dean, you kind of still what I was gonna say. I was gonna challenge the premise of the question, which is almost like, hey, just because of the structure of the organization would then imply whether there is objectivity or not. And I really do think that, Dean, what you said was spot on, which is, you know, the data scientists in our teams, they actually don't spend that much time analyzing every single experiment. Like most of the experiments readout were just directly from the platform itself. And a lot of the times that they spend on more complex experimental design. And this is not so much about, you know, can we be objective in the readout or not, right? So, but also just coming back to your original question, at Dean, we are a centralized data team, actually includes all the data scientists, AI engineers all together. The part that I think is actually maybe very similar to what Katrina, you were saying, which is we are a centralized team, but each of those teams who are working in a particular area or product lines, they are very closely embedded within those areas. So they understand the problem that they're solving. They work hand in hand with other cross-functional teams to solve those problems.
Yeah, Ronnie?
Yeah, so, and you can go with a model that I think you've hinted at, which is the center of excellence that provides some of the standardization across the organizations. And to me, that's very, very important, because what you want to be able to have is some consistency, and some of the leaders in the data science be able to sort of teach the decentralized organizations what to happen. I think that the point that you're hinting, and I'm famous for saying, you know, data scientists need to be, you know, skeptics, are the places where a data scientist reports to some leader that has the motivation to ship, and therefore not necessarily allocate the time to investigate anomalies or things that are suspicious in some of the results. And this is where I think your point is kind of interesting, because I've had those situations where an org had a very positive result, there were some anomalies, and the question was, do we allocate weeks of a data scientist to go and drill into something that is suspicious, or do we let it go? And there's an inherent organizational bias not to fight against success. Just to give you sort of an extreme, something extreme that I did is on my Airbnb data science team, one of the OKRs that I gave the centralized team was to reverse results that the business decisions made, that the business made as decisions. So they got credit if they found that the business made some decision X, and they were able to go in and prove that that is not correct and get the business to reverse it. And that's, I think, like Yas saying, most of the times we don't even see the examples. They're coming from some automated system. If you're able to do some additional tests, if you're able to, you know, do that against, and a good example, a sample ratio mismatch test, and if the system doesn't automatically do it and you do it and you find the problem, you should get credit for invalidating a result.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's fascinating. This actual incentive for being sort of a successful and persuasive devil's advocate. I also like your point about the automation there. Like, that can we take individual analyses that data scientists do that give us reasons to be skeptical about tests and turn them into automation? A simple one being sample ratio mismatch, where there's not the right number of people in treatment or control. And I know that that a lot of tech companies have automatic flags around that kind of thing, or covariate imbalances, et cetera. So sometimes the role of the data scientist is to automate away themselves so they can do more interesting stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, I actually, on my engineering team, I specifically gave them the mission of sort of putting the data scientists out of a job, sort of as a joke. In reality, what you make is you make their life more interesting. The things that are mundane that they have to do all the time, you want to automate, you want to leave them the more complex and interesting stuff to do.
One of the questions that Katrina, you just brought up, and kind of riffing on some stuff that Ronnie had talked about, is what should we test? Should every change that is going to go live, should that go through an A/B test? What are the exceptions there? And a lot of kind of very process-oriented perspectives would say basically test everything. And I think, Ronnie, maybe you want to start with the test everything perspective or something close. I don't know.
I'm a big fan of test everything, you know, within limits. You know, there is a cost to every test. My job as, you know, the experimentation platform provider at Microsoft, for example, was to minimize that incremental cost so that nobody can say this was too expensive, it was taking too long, we cut it out of the release, right? So I am a fan of the ideal of test everything. Sometimes it's hard, you know, sometimes, you know, you got this patch to some operating system that needs to be deployed urgently because there's a security flaw and you just can't run the experiment. So there are limits, but I like the ideal of test everything.
Mm-hmm. I also just really like the idea that if you're not testing everything, like that maybe, or close to everything, that's a sign that your experimentation tools aren't low friction enough.
I think that's a really good point. But I think like the thing that I don't like about the moniker test everything is that testing is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. It's a means to business impact. It's a means to helping customers. It's a means to improving the experience. And so what I would say is learn what the impact of everything. And that would be the kind of the broader mandate that I would give the team. Testing quantitatively matters, is a great way of learning. And I often, every time I've ever tried to, you know, not A/B test, let's just do something else, often I will regret it. But there are specific ways that learning might make more sense before you test. So like, if you think about like a search model, it's like you can't do a design mock-up and like show customers, do you like this better? Or do you like this better? Like the search results actually matter, and you kind of have to do that on production.
Pipeline of ideas, Katrina. I think you're hitting on a different point, which is somewhat orthogonal, which is how do you develop the thing that people actually code and then ship to the customers? The question is, if there is code involved or a config involved, do you ever deploy that without a test? And my view is no. You should, every code change, every config change must be deployed.
And let me give you an example. And so let me give you an example. So like when I was at Upwork, one of the areas that we were talking about is job search. Very important, you know, millions of daily active users who are working on this, or and what we were trying to do is kind of change the filters in a pretty dramatic way. Within a day of launching the A/B test, we had 100 comments in the community where they were like, what about this? What about this? And this was good and this wasn't good. And we knew everything we needed to know on that first day without having to run the test for 8 weeks. We're like, wow, all these things suck about this and we actually need to solve them. And there were some pretty big things that we basically were like, you know, if we could just go back and change these, let's do a week-long sprint, let's just fix all of these things, then let's launch an A/B test, we'll be in a better place. And so to me, what I learned from that was I should just create that, like essentially like a magic link, put it on the community, have them give feedback right away, have a bunch of people kind of volunteer, tell us what's wrong. It might be fine, right? Like there may be places where it's like, we're not catching any serious issues. But in that way, I felt like testing became almost a constraint. It's like, well, we launched an A/B test and my PMs were like, well, I need to keep it running because I said it was going to be 8 weeks. And I'm like, thank you for doing that because, you know, that's the right process. But we already know how to make this product 50% better than it was before we got all these 100 comments. And so we we shouldn't be constrained to the testing environment. Like we should then A/B test the next launch code, the next kind of set of changes. And so if we can be creative in looking for those ways to learn quickly with a code change on production, I think you could do that through user testing, but I just don't necessarily think it's the same. And ultimately we did test it, but there's a place where testing becomes just like such a revered thing that you actually aren't creative and you don't learn as quickly as you could because of that. And so that's what I kind of want to steer away from.
I think Ya has some thoughts on this.
I don't think there is any conflict with what both Katrina and Ronnie are saying. I think we're just saying that there are different ways to narrow down ideas. Mm-hmm. And either that is user research, either that is maybe a early, not A/B test, but whitelist a few people and getting that real user feedback on the product that you're launching. And even in our book that we actually also went extensively talking about how do you use historical data to maybe do some observational causal studies to narrow down ideas as well. So I think that's not conflict with each other. And I think ultimately, I'm actually really strongly with Ronnie on this. The aspiration should really be testing everything, not as in testing is the only thing you do, but as you are making changes to production, either that is through code changes or through config changes, we've learned from a lot of the big mistakes that we made in the past, how important it is. But the difference, another important difference I wanted to call out is that it's not that you tested it and then you should go exactly what the test is telling you, the result is saying, right? I think you should have a holistic understanding of why the result it is what it is. For example, when we first launched video on LinkedIn platform, it was no impact on the platform, right? Because the adoption was really small. But then as we actually started to have a lot more adoption, video turned out to be extremely successful on our platform. So the point is, don't just take the results from the experiment itself and make a conclusion as this is going to be what the impact will be longer term. But doing the test from the very beginning is really important because that gives you that baseline to start evaluating.
Well, and oftentimes it's really just about removing some of that downside risk. You're worried that maybe this actually has some negative impact. And so that can free you up to take riskier bets because you've ruled out some of the negative. Sheridan, I think you had some thoughts on this.
Yeah, so at Meta, in general, we experiment a lot and with nearly everything, and the experimentation process is effectively embedded within the product development lifecycle. What I I mean, there are extremes to this, right? I mean, I think, if you're going to your corporate page and you're increasing or changing the photos of your corporate board members or something, that's not something you need to test. I mean, I'm always reminded of of one of my favorite phrases from my econ class in business school, which is information is worthless unless it has the power to change a decision. What I will say is that, and I think Ya was getting at this with some of the other methods, experimentation is not an excuse for sloppy product thinking, right? And you have got to still have good disciplined product thinking and design and not use experimentation as a way and means around that. So
that's a great point.
Yeah, I think Ronnie likes highlighting some of these examples, usually from Amazon search results of, somebody tested something against some metric and therefore now they're serving up very weird search results just to have something to show here. So yeah, having that discipline is really important. Actually, one question from Dmitry Masterov, which seems really related to this, is actually kind of on the other end of test everything, which is about actually putting things into a test that maybe aren't ready yet, and what incentives that can create for teams to just try actually too many things that maybe are half-baked because they perhaps aren't really penalized for all the potential harms that their many half-baked ideas are producing, whereas the individuals are rewarded for the successful ideas that were hidden somewhere in there. And so what kind of pre-testing discipline does one need to have there, or what other incentives should one have when thinking about the cost of experimentation, not the setup costs, but the cost of potentially really serving a inferior version of the product to a bunch of users?
I'll go with that. I talk a lot about safe velocity as a concept that we started to develop, and it's sort of the opposite of the normal A/B testing. So in a normal A/B test, you're powering it up, you're making sure you're going to be able to detect the 0.3% delta that you want to generate. But in a safe deployment, what you're doing is really trying to make sure in near real time that you're not hurting the users. And if you're going to degrade some key metric by 10%, you don't need 1/10 the time, you need over 1/100th of the time, because there's an n squared there in the power formula. And so one of the uses that developed over time is this idea that if you launch something and it's bad, the system will automatically abort your experiment. So I do think that we are protecting a lot of the downsides of a bad deployment, and it gives you some safety net that is important. You're still, if you cause some outage, you're still going to go into the severity review and they require a postmortem, and that's enough of a penalty. But I want to encourage people to try things quickly that they think might have a big impact. Some of the biggest breakthroughs that we've had came because somebody tried an idea that wasn't sort of sanctioned or approved. I'll give an example from way back when we did the first experiment of opening something in a new window. There was such a strong message from the designers that we couldn't do this and it's not conventional, and yet it had so clear positive results. And over the years, you now see everybody doing that, right? So it was the opposite. Sort of the users' benefit outweighed a lot of the considerations that we've had at the time. And this was 10 years ago, that people were concerned about. So I want to encourage people to try some weird stuff, even though it's risky, and then see the result. If it's bad, we'll abort it quickly.
And so what you're talking about is a pretty sophisticated system. The companies that I've worked at are definitely smaller and have less of those capabilities. I think there's kind of two big things that I would say in response to this question. One is what is the process leading up to an experiment? And then two, what do you do after the experiment? And so leading up to an experiment, making sure, for example, that you have specifically like a hypothesis that you're just thinking through, like what would success look like? That alone often is enough just to make sure it's not spaghetti code. Like it really makes sense. And if you, some kind of review of that test plan beforehand, whether it be a centralized committee or whether it just be your end partners or your analytics partners, or there's someone who's sort of the arbiter of that. And then at the tail end, rewarding learning. And so I think that's the kind of the most powerful thing is, what do leaders do in the organization? And are they only praising the positive tests? Or are they saying, hey, we did this and we learned this, and now we're going to do, XYZ because of that? I think that is a really, really important practice that's day in, day out, but that really does kind of illustrate what you value, and that can help with some of this incentive problem.
And I just wanted to add, in addition to what Ronnie and Christina has already said, one thing that is really important is also we always have this culture when we think about going to experiment and try something. The thesis should always be, if you are not willing to launch this to all the users, like don't experiment it, right? If there's no path to that, and if there's no intuition why this could actually be a good thing, don't launch it. And so this sort of, this behavior of just let me just try random things, through spaghetti at the wall. I think it really just we actually don't see that kind of behavior because of that sort of thesis to start with. And obviously the other really important piece that Christina has already mentioned is this learning piece, right? Whenever we talk about ramping something, or this is launched to 100% of our users, the one thing that we always talk about Finance Center is, what do we learn? Hey, what is your hypothesis? And that is happening with every single launch that we do. So that's sort of again another, at the end of the experiment, a gatekeeper as well.
Yeah, and on this point is sort of being a gatekeeper and sometimes kind of really constraining the process that experimenters should follow. Can sometimes create a little bit of antagonism between experimentation tool builders and the users of those tools internally. And so how should teams building data tools, especially experimentation tools, prioritize requests from their internal customers? right? Who sometimes have great suggestions, and you can do things like focus groups and really work closely with them. But also a lot of times they might lead you astray away from some of these really nice process innovations. And I know this is something, for example, that Sheridan, you've thought a bit about.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question and a really good balance. I mean, I joked the other day to somebody that if we did, our experimenters want, experiments that are infinitely short time with infinitely many metrics calculated instantaneously, right? And there are clearly limits to, like, in compute to be able to do that. I think one of the things that we think about a lot at Meta in experimentation is both like the quality of the experiment and then the efficiency with which I can run it as a user. And sometimes people think those are in tension with each other, right? And sometimes I'll get people complain, oh, why are you making me fill out a hypothesis? Or why are you making me fill out a goal metric? And so on and so on in that, right? It's taking me, 5, 10, 15 more minutes to kind of go through a more principled design. And I think there are a couple of things to think about that. One is, I think that there's some minimal base level of quality of the experiment that you always want. The second is I think there are ways that those are not necessarily always in tension with each other, right? So we think a lot about, like, what are standardized templates for similar types of experiments. We have people used to not know, for instance, how many users to allocate to an experiment, right, to be properly powered. And we had, experiments that were improperly powered. So we developed sets of tools to instantly recommend those numbers, right? So simultaneously, we're making the user experience easier and more and better in practice because it's well powered. So I do think there is this natural tension, but it's not always a tension. So.
Mm-hmm. And there can be those kind of carrots that go along with some of those other things.
Yeah, and we measure very strongly, like, how teams and organizations are doing on the quality of experiments, right? And they kind of bubble those results up to leaders.
Cool. I mean, one thing I'd like to go to you, Katrina, on this topic is just when you're in a smaller company, right? I mean, some of these giants, when they're choosing buy or build, they often tilt really heavily towards build because they actually have a lot of internal users. And so, when you're in a smaller firm and when you're evangelizing experimentation, how have you thought about that balance between buy and build for a lot of experimentation and data science tooling?
That's a good question, and I've been in the position to actually build all of the time, but that is partially because of just the nature of our businesses, working at marketplace businesses where there's a lot of interactions that happen. There's a lot of things to measure, and a lot of the off-the-shelf tools are really good for example, a product where your primary product is a landing page and you just want to optimize that, or something that's a little bit shallower in terms of the set of interactions and the time that it takes to often get to a revenue outcome or a business outcome. And so I've been more on the build side in terms of kind of the core experimentation tools, the core analysis tools. That said, I am a big advocate of buying, in particular, like tools like Heap or Amplitude for user engagement, anything that really allows people to self-serve, and in particular PMs to self-serve in a faster way that frees up data science and analytics. So foundational experimentation tools, I haven't found one that has really worked for my particular use cases, but a lot of the complementary tools I have found, and I definitely think those tools are much better than anything that at my scale we could have built.
Yeah, and I guess there's also sort of intermediate ground of using things like open source software like PlanOut or Axe that both came out at Facebook, but those solve a constrained part of the problem. They're not doing a lot of the things like, oh, and here's your experimentation dashboard, and here's merging in all the metrics, et cetera. So there's still a lot of building that goes into that. So actually, since you touched on that, working in a marketplace, I think a lot of you have worked in settings like marketplaces, social networks, sometimes both mixed together, like at LinkedIn or Facebook, where units and experiments can affect each other. What do you see as the practical state of the art for accounting for these spillovers in your setting? Or do they even matter all that much, right? We have now a whole bunch of academics really interested in this, in part because, we like hard problems, right? But what's the state of the art with all of that? I'd be interested to hear how much maybe your perspective, Ronnie, has changed or not, having spent a bit more time more recently in a setting where there is this two-sided marketplace.
So I'm actually going to punt on this because my ability to talk about Airbnb work is very restricted without getting prior approvals.
Okay.
I will pass it on to Ya, I think, who's going to talk about some of the work she's done.
Cool.
Sure, happy to. So LinkedIn, this is actually a pretty important problem for LinkedIn, because if I think about LinkedIn, we are really just made up of a bunch of marketplaces, right? We have this knowledge marketplace where people are producing content and then people are consuming content. That's like, again, sort of a marketplace. We have sort of this ads marketplace, you have advertisers and buyers, right? And then you have this talent marketplace, you have people who's looking for jobs and people who are trying to hire. So various different marketplaces. And to answer your question, as in is it important, it's absolutely critical. That's my lesson number one. Being spending several years here now. The approach, however, varies. And this is actually, and I can give you 3 examples where it has been extremely valuable for us as a both practical, but also at the same time, very effective approaches we've been addressing those. The first one is really graph partitioning, right? And then you think about LinkedIn being a social network, and a lot of interference actually between the nodes are happening through the connections that they have. So this one in particular, like for folks who have been working on social network or real life social network, it's actually it's not easy, right? It's not like this small world, like sort of multiple simulated graphs. It's actually very both sparse, but also you got those big nodes that can skew your partition very easily. So the part that we find that to be super useful is what we call this ego net. We kind of start with a node in the graph, and we kind of build a graph around that individual, and then partition in that what we call ego network, right? So that's one approach that we have found to be very useful. The second approach that we found to be very useful is really try to measure this downstream impact successfully. So let's give a very simple example. Let's say Bill Gates on LinkedIn platform posted, an article, right? And then that article then be turned into like notifications for people who've been following him, and then people come and engage with that post, and then it further gets propagated and cascaded throughout the network, right? And then like that single post can actually impact or bring value to a lot of millions of people who are in our network. Many of them actually follow him directly. So how do we then measure those impact? So the way that we do is we do attribution, right? We take downstream engagement and we attribute it appropriately to the upstream action, which in this case is Bill Gates actually posted something on LinkedIn. So that, and then we are able to then do the right attribution, then be able to attribute it to the experimental unit. And because of that, we then able to measure it same as what we do with any other metrics that we have in our experimentation platform, very scalable, right? So that's the second approach. The third approach,
with that, do you have to, when you're doing that attribution, do you have to provide some kind of discount factor? Because often if they hadn't interacted with Bill Gates, they would have interacted with somebody else. And so how do you make those attributions solid? Or
yeah, I mean that itself is the attribution. I'm simplifying it. I'm not simplifying, but I'm glossing over the detail regarding how you can make those attribution rigorous, right? With that, I'm actually going to refer you to some papers that we have instead of me going through here and going into the technical details. The third aspect is this. What we call like a budget split. So this is in particular with in advertisements in particular. So if you're thinking about from consumer experience, when you are clicking on ads, and the ads has a budget behind it, right? So if you imagine that you have a better algorithm that is able to rank better ads higher, and hence that users are interacting with those ads more frequently, so they would deplete the budget faster than that there will be low budget left for the control arm, right? And then so the way to do it, it seems a very intuitive approach, but I think that a lot of those challenges is in details, is take the budget that comes from this particular campaign, and then you split it, right? You say, hey, if I run a 50-50 treatment control, I only have, the control arm can only have 50% budget, right? So when it's run out of budget, then it goes into the other, ads campaigns that would be competing for that slot. So this is, again, it can be generalized if you think about as in scenarios where control and treatments are competing for the same resources. In this case, and that if you are able to split those appropriately, those resources appropriately, then that's another way that you can, I want to say, separate out those potential interference between treatment and control.
So that also has its own costs because you've just made the whole market thinner.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the lesson that we have learned is that that those concern is second order. And then the first order concern with regarding competing budget utilization is actually a much, much bigger problem. I mean, all these we have seen, I mean, being extremely valuable. Now it's really a common practice that for experiments that's running in those areas, that we always measure downstream impacts. We always use budget split testing for the big experiments.
Cool. Yeah, I'd be interested to hear from you, Katrina, about how you've approached this in a marketplace setting.
Which part in particular would be most useful?
Well, I guess I'm just saying what tools have you used to deal with the fact that, if you change some search ranking or some price suggestions for people who are listing apartments or people who are listing jobs, that it can be hard to know whether you're having spillovers between treatment and control. And oftentimes you could, especially I think in these marketplace settings, it's really possible to get the sign of the treatment effects potentially wrong. So
yeah, this is a really hard problem. The way that I have been solving it is by particularly leaning on economist partners. And so, at Upwork, that was a team that we built out. I built out while I was there is just an economist function. And in particular for these types of experiments where pricing, ranking, anything around like the connections between people, the test plans that we came up with tended to be much more complex than what a typical PM could come up with, or a typical analyst, but really helped us think through multiple things. The way we often would do phases of tests, or sort of isolate the hypotheses and figure out kind of what can we test at once and how do we kind of minimize those crossover effects. And so the solution is, planning it in advance, having the right kind of thought partners and the right experience on the team. And then it's definitely much more involved. I would say kind of the investment that we put in, even into planning, into the analysis that preceded it, into the analysis that concluded it, as well as even to like explaining up to other people what we were trying to do, which was much more complex than they expected, was probably at least 5 times more than a regular test. Think about like on the logged out page, are people registering more or less? That's more of a simpler test. This was probably 5 to 10x as much work, but really allowed us to learn really complicated things 5 to 10x better. It was worth the investment.
Yeah. And my sense is routinizing these things is really like sort of just right on the edge of what some of the biggest and most sophisticated firms are doing. I was just describing doing some of this. Facebook has recently published some papers that suggest that they've increasingly routinized some of the things that when I was there were much harder to do. And, we're seeing some of that from the other ride sharing companies of what kinds of, tests they're doing. So my sense is for most people, for most firms, it's still a lot of heavy lifting to do those kinds of experiments. Sheridan, I don't know if you wanted to chime in.
Yeah, I will say, for us, I mean, we think of them as clustered experiments, and clearly we have lots of different cases, and we have messaging platforms. So if you have one person in test and one person in control on two sides of the conversation, right, well, you're going to run into problems like that. I think for us, we tend to federate out the choice of how you think about what those clusters are to the individual teams, right? So we don't necessarily have that, but we provide the frameworks and tooling and solutions that you can run your own clusters.
Yeah, right. The cluster for one experiment may be very different than the
maybe very different, right? Yeah. So there's no, so we don't have a kind of concept of a bunch of predefined existing clusters across the whole network, right? So.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Cool. So I want to turn to another topic, which is kind of multiple experiments or sequences of experiments. And I think, the most basic version of this is just ramping or replicating. But a lot of times it's more sophisticated than that. There's kind of a series of experiments that help us learn something. And so how are you seeing teams best use iterative experimentation? What are the best ways to use a sequence of experiments to not just like replicate, yes, this was a win, but to actually like hone in on new, better ideas, better parts of the parameter space, etc.
I can go there to start off with. Yeah. I think obviously, I think many people in this conference are familiar with Aitan Bakshi, who runs our adaptive experimentation group at Meta, and so we have a kind of a fairly sophisticated parameter tuning sequence bandits thing for running across multiple parameter tunings, and that can often be a much better solution than running a bunch of sequential experiments. What I will say on sequential experiments is I think there are good sequential experiments and bad sequential experiments. And I think good sequential experiments are ones which at least have some form of planning up front about, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this, and if this is this, I'm going to do Y and Z, as opposed to like, I'm just going to try something and then try something again. And by the way, I'm only marginally changing it. And so, right, am I running into a p-hacking problem by running 8 quote unquote different experiments, but really aren't actually that different from each other? And so I think a lot of the stuff where I see teams running good sequenced experiments is where they put a lot of thought up front into what that sequencing is. That's not to say there won't be deviations to that or you won't learn and do things, but some good upfront thought and planning on how you're going to sequence, I think, is essential.
Yeah, Ronnie, I don't know if you have some thoughts about that. I mean, I know you're a big fan of the idea that we run some initial tests and then we got to run the bigger replication to pin down a bunch of effects, but beyond that.
Yeah, so well, these are different things. So one is, how confident are you of the result? I've had people get results that are very borderline. In fact, when I came to Airbnb, when I looked at, many of the results, they were powered just around being 0.05, which I think is a mistake, because I think if you're an organization that tries to learn, then putting an arbitrary threshold isn't good enough. And because of the large failure rate, when I did start to do replication runs, we realized that many of the wins were actually false positives. I mean, all the ways where like, a third of the results are just incorrect. And so we instantiated sort of a process where you have to either get a much lower p-value or you have to do a replication run so you can do this. But I think there's another thrust to your question, which is, is it important to iterate? And this is where, to me, it's all about the learnings. When you have even when you have a successful experiment, I opened my book with this, really strange thing. When you move the second line of the first line and revenue increases by 12%, you just launched it. No, we probably did like 15 runs after that to try and break down which of the things really made a difference. Was it the fonts got bigger? Was it the color that was different than that? And so to me, the iteration, even when you have a win, it's very important to try to run variants around those points of the change. You went from here to here. Well, what happens? Why was it so successful? And, you know, I'm a big fan of, you know, heterogeneous treatment effects. We implemented that automatically in our system. I think it was one of the things that opened the eyes of many, many groups to surprising things. We, you know, we would tell them, you know, the experiment looks just generally flat, but look, it's very successful here, or worse, it's really dramatically bad on this segment. And then it turns out that it was a bug for that browser version, or, you know, Samsung TV or whatever, that just brought down the average materially. So to me, that ability to identify interesting segments and get the groups to sort of spawn new ideas about why this segment is failing and then iterate, that's critical.
Yeah, and I really like your point that it's not just about this binary decision, because often these experiments are multi-purpose. We're trying to do things like resource allocation. Should this engineer keep working on it? Should there be 3 more engineers and a designer working on this area because this is promising? Or is it just like, this was barely good enough to be worth launching?
Right. Yeah, and in fact, I mean, the idea of the slowdown experiment that we ran at Microsoft that slowed the experience to understand the impact was one of the probably most profound things that just funded the whole team, right? We realized that performance was much, much more important than we thought. And, you know, that learning that came out had impact for years.
Cool. Yeah, so I wanted to ask a couple of questions that are sort of related to, once we've got a bunch of experiments, what can we do with that? One of the things that was mentioned earlier was like measuring the quality of experiments that different teams are running, or also trying to get a sense of, are we running out of innovations in certain areas over time? What are the trends in experimentation? So I'd be interested to know what can we learn in aggregate from experiments? I mean, one metric that we might look at, even just to know how experimentation is going in our organization, is how many experiments are we running? How many are getting launched or not? But what are some of the other things you'd look at in aggregate about experimentation in the company?
We have been, we call this sort of a meta analysis on the experiments. And so the one benefit of having a centralized experimentation platform is that you actually are able to collect all the meta information about every single experiment you've run. And it turned out to be extremely valuable. And I will give maybe 3 concrete examples that kind of representing different space. The first example is we actually took a look at how we're running experiments, and as in how long does each experiment run, how do they go from maybe a small percentage of ramp to a bigger percentage ramp. And we are actually then, by analyzing all these practices that people use, we are able to pin down how we can, the best practices that we should have for running experiments. So how do we run it, you know, balancing both sort of what we call like the speed, quality, and risk when you are doing experimentation, right? So I think that's one example. Second example was we have taken a look at how experiments, so we have this recommendation on LinkedIn called PYMK, people you may know. So recommending connections for other people. So one thing that we have done is by looking at, because in experiment, there's going to be an experiment period. Let's say we have run experiment for 1 week. And then so some people have connected with maybe more people sooner because of a better algorithm before this algorithm gets ramped to 100%. So by analyzing a lot of the experiments that we are iterating on those PYMK algorithm, we're actually able to draw some really powerful causal conclusion with regarding the connections and which kind of connections on LinkedIn is able to help with people's job advancement, right? So that's another paper that we actually have out on that. It's a really powerful thing, again, based on the meta-analysis that we've done. The third category of analysis we've done is also just by looking at how different metrics are relating with each other. They either, so this, I don't mean as in, oh, maybe this metric, if you're looking at a time series, how this metric is correlating with another metric, right? We are looking at how the delta are correlating with each other across all different kind of experiments. So that is also extremely powerful because we, number one, have a much better understanding of the metrics themselves. And then second of all, we also can see, hey, this kind of experiments is really effective at driving this kind of value, which represents, by certain metrics that we track. So all these three categories of research that we are able to do because of those data that we have on experiments has been extremely valuable.
Yeah, I mean, I think compared with a lot of the academic world, it's so amazing to be able to say, look, this is the universe of experiments we ran in this area, which is so often really just in somebody's file drawer in academia. So really powerful. Yeah.
And one thing that I found being that kind of a different angle, and this is actually something I learned from MIT's own John Horton, but just thinking about kind of the body of knowledge that we have and the big questions that we want to answer. And so that's something that I've really taken forward at Department List in terms of what are all the things that we don't know that we need to learn in order to be successful, and how do we learn those systematically through all of the means available to us, whether it be A/B testing, a combination of user testing, talking to the salespeople who are talking to customers every day, and sort of that body of knowledge that's more qualitative, like about our customers and what they want and what works, is really, really useful, while also thinking about we want to continue to serve adjacent customers that maybe, some of those learnings don't apply. And so I think that kind of meta-analysis of like the qualitative things, what do we really know about our customers, has been really useful for me.
Yeah, Sheridan.
Yeah, I think one of my, I've worked on a lot of data products over the years, and one of my favorite phrases is the cobbler's children have no shoes. And what I mean by that is data products are often great at measuring everybody else's and all the other teams and users they serve with results, but are very bad at looking at themselves, right? And I think that was true to some extent at our company, but we've spent a lot of time investing in our own analytics group within at Meta, building up our own data scientists, our own analytics, our own data engineers to really build comprehensive sets of metrics about our experiments, about how users are using the experimentation product themselves, even now moving into kind of clickstream data around that. And I think it's important. And it's similar to some of the stuff that Yar mentioned. Like we measure very strongly the quality of the experiment. So we worked with some of our top data scientists in the company to think about the entire experimentation life cycle and think about all of the practices we want to see right through from design to deprecation of that experiment, and have charts that we're able to show at an aggregate level and an individual team level. Likewise with efficiency, like looking at how much experiments used in compute, how quickly results get shown, how quickly we're able to make decisions on experiments, seeming well planned and so on. And so I think that's been really, really powerful for us, both for us as an experimentation platform to understand what and how we should build, and then more broadly as we've built up big broad sets of metadata around experimentation, how we're doing net in aggregate on our experiments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, then a lot of times you need a bunch of that metadata about the experiments. Otherwise, each meta-analysis is like slogging through a whole bunch of garbage experiments that aren't real or that were aborted or that had problems or so.
It was a huge complaint. I remember speaking to a data scientist about 3 years ago, and like how much effort it took just to run a meta-analysis across that person's individual group. But we've kind of democratized that and have whole sets of data within our warehouse that are designed around being able to do good, strong meta-analysis.
Cool, and I think we've got a question from Sean Taylor, if you want to answer your question live.
Yeah, I'm interested in your take on, I know, Ronnie, you're famous for the overall evaluation criterion being sort of an important tool for decision makers within an organization. And I'm kind of curious, like the extent to which you've been successful driving this elsewhere, and whether this is something that's an achievable goal for most organizations. You could think of experimentation at its, in its optimal form could be driving an organization and aligning it across all the different units if it's used very effectively. But it also seems increasingly challenging to have a one-size-fits-all launch rule, and some kind of curious best practices for creating that kind of alignment across a large organization.
Yeah, so I'm assuming this is directed at me, and I believe it's critical. I think every organization that I started to work with, every onboard that I did in Microsoft, the first question that I used to say is, what are we optimizing for? And work with the team to understand the business and try to narrow that to a very small set of metrics. ideally that can be combined into a single overall evaluation criterion. It's tough. You know, I have to give you an example. At Bing, we created one, and there was a small team of maybe 4 or 5 people that worked several months every year to come up with next year's OEC. So it was recognized as something that we need to evolve over time as our understanding improves, but we're going to have to invest in it. I think from a leadership perspective, the ability for the leader to actually give a goal that's quantified helps align the organization immensely, right? Because a lot of the times you'll see people saying something fuzzy and multiple people interpret it differently, and that causes people to run in different directions. So it's not just about running fast, it's about getting the org to run in the same direction. And so I believe it's a key thing. I believe it's also very hard. You see organizations that over time understand how to evolve their OEC. And people may start out with something easy, like, you know, take the example of YouTube, where it was like, we're optimizing for minutes. Well, over time, you realize that some of the minutes are bad minutes. You know, is clickbait counting as good minutes or not? In search engines, we used to count just clicks, but then we said, okay, if there's a quick back, if people come back from the destination, we sent them quickly, that shouldn't be counted. And so you begin to refine the understanding of the domain and come up with, you know, sometimes more complicated versions that capture the essence of what is better for the long-term user.
And I think there's always more to learn there. You might go from counting all interactions to counting only meaningful social interactions. And then you might discover that there's still some problems there and you have to iterate.
And there's fraud that you have to remove and you have to invest in it. All this good stuff develops over time. But, you know, again, to your question about is it important, I think it's critical. I think it's the first thing. Now, doesn't mean that the whole company needs to align it. There may be different OECs for different big business units, but the more you can align, the better off you are.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, Katrina, as someone leading a product organization.
I don't feel like I have kind of a strong perspective. I think, you know, we are just kind of in the early stages of figuring it out. And I definitely aspire to do more of the things that Ronnie's talking about.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it can be a really hard process to get that kind of agreement. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Cool. I think so. We are basically out of time. I know we could talk a lot more, but I feel very lucky to have gotten an hour of each of our panelists' time to talk about these issues. And so thanks so much.